This time, on Cryptid Mysterious, we have an incident out of South Carolina. My mother had passed away several years ago, with my father having died 12 years previously, and my brother had been killed in the Desert Storm campaign, so I was the only surviving heir. Among other things, my inheritance consisted of my parents' property in northern South Carolina. It consisted of an old plantation home nestled in about 90 acres of land. Back in the day, the land had been used for growing cotton, but hadn't seen any of that for close to 100 years. My brother and I had grown up on this land, and we would always hunt and fish in the surrounding area. Now, my wife and I didn't live far from my mother's place. Our two children were grown and had their own lives, so she and I had decided to move to my parents' home and rent our own house out. Now, my parents' house was beautiful and quite grand in scale. The previous owner, as well as the family who built it, had been very well-to-do. The woodworking and attention to detail throughout the home was top-notch, and had been maintained by my father until his passing. He was a man that treated this house like the curator of a museum. I had never noticed that, despite all the original details, the back door had been replaced with a steel door at some time. I don't know if it was done when my dad was alive or if my mother had it replaced while she was here alone, but neither of them had ever mentioned it, and I had never noticed it. It was very odd. Much of the property was grassy, but there was a large tract of woods on its edge. The grass had grown wild since my father's passing, and you wouldn't dare walk out in that grass in the state it was in, because it surely was chock full of snakes. There was also a small creek running through the northeast portion of the property, and out in the fields there were 14 fruit trees, which were very old, so far as trees go. When I was younger, my mother would make a variety of different pies and tarts, and she had a place in our pantry for all her homemade preserves and jams. At some point, after having moved in, I had refired the old tractor and began to cut the fields back into shape again. There was one large barn out back where my dad kept the tractor and some yard tools, and outside of that, it served only as a large, mostly empty habitat for barn owls. When I realized that the owls were there, I always left the doors slightly open for them. It was really cool to watch them going in and out. We had lived there for almost 2 years, and everything was working out perfectly. Feeling like I was a child again, and reliving my youth on the land and in the house that I had grown up in. In the summer and fall of our second year, things started getting a little weird around the property. My wife and I had started hearing some loud howling emanating in the distance. Way back in the far end of our land or beyond, it would always begin around dusk, and there were many nights when it would rouse us from our sleep in the middle of the night. It was a long, steady howl, very much like a fire department siren in both volume and duration. However, it was much deeper. I don't really remember saying anything to my wife other than remarking that there must be some animals in the woods. Funny thing was that I didn't recall any such sounds being present there when I was growing up. Now, as I said earlier, I began cutting the fields, and because of this, my wife and I had regained access to the fruit trees once again. And this was the season for harvesting. Don't get me wrong, we weren't like my mom, making preserves and pies or anything like that, but we were picking some of the fruits to eat. When I tell you I'm not a farmer, that would be an understatement, but I started to notice that the fruits on the trees were disappearing. My wife and I were picking only a couple of dozen pieces a week, which wasn't even a smidgen of what was there for the picking. I wasn't even pruning them, and each tree had to have been producing hundreds of pieces of fruit. The trees' combined output was incredible, producing bushels and bushels of fruit. When I was young, my mother and father would grab almost every piece that the insects or birds didn't damage, and the rest would fall to the ground and rot. What I was seeing was quite the contrary. Fruit was disappearing from the trees, and virtually nothing was being left on the ground. These trees were being stripped of their fruit just as fast as it ripened, and I couldn't wrap my head around what might be going on, or what might be doing such a thing. One night, after the fall had changed into winter and the trees had stopped yielding fruit, my wife was in the kitchen preparing our dinner when I heard what sounded like a pot falling into the sink. As my wife exclaimed, "Oh my gosh!" and ran into the den. She was visibly shaken and white as a ghost, and she sat down in a chair, holding her head in her hands. I asked her what was wrong, and she didn't answer me. I asked her what had happened, and she just stared at me as she was gathering her composure. A moment later, she answered. I was washing the dishes, not really paying attention to anything in particular, as I lifted my head to put a clean pot into the dish rack. The most hideous face that you could imagine was looking at me through the window, and as quickly as I had seen it, the face was gone. Honey, you have to call the police right away. I'm not kidding. Whatever that was is out there in our yard right now. I picked up the phone and made the call. I told them that there was a prowler in our yard and that my wife had seen him looking in our window. They said that an officer would be right over. We watched as the officer pulled into the driveway a few minutes later. We opened the door, stepped out to greet him, and my wife started to frantically tell him what had happened to her. He told her to try to calm down and asked her to show him the window that she had seen the prowler from. I could tell he was trying to see if there was anything that could have made a reflection in the glass that might have looked like a man. That's when my wife said to him, "It wasn't a man. It was the face of a ghoul. It was horrible beyond description." I could see in his face that he was wondering what kind of people we were as my wife started to describe to him what happened. She told him that it had wide-set eyes that were much larger than ours, and she said that it was smiling with what she said was the biggest, most demonic grin she had ever seen. And as soon as she had locked eyes with it, the thing vanished from sight. The officer said that he was going to go outside and have a look around. And as I closed the steel door behind us, I began to think that it might have been installed for a reason. I walked alongside the officer, carrying a fire poker in my hand. The officer carried a large mag light. As he began shining it around, he put the beam right on the barn doors, and the doors were wide open. Before I could say anything, he asked me if I always leave my barn open. I told him that the door on the right was always open a crack for the barn owls to go in and out, but on this day they were wide open, so the two of us walked over there to have a look around. The hair was standing up on the back of my head as we walked towards the barn, and I felt as though something was breathing down my neck. As he put the light into the barn and shined it around, we could see that there was nothing inside except the tractor, the tools used around the house. He asked me if I could see anything missing, to which I said no. We kept walking around the house, shining the light here and there, and saw absolutely nothing. But I had the creepiest feeling that we were being watched as he and I went back into the house. The officer sat us both down, looked us square in the eyes, and told us, "I'm not about to say that you didn't see anything because I can see that you're obviously still shaken up over this. The doors were open in the barn, so maybe there was some local hoodlum prowling around looking for something to walk off with that they could sell. My wife broke into hysteria, saying it was not a man. It was some kind of monster. He said, "I understand, but there's really nothing more that I can do here tonight. Why don't you go, leave all the lights on, stay up until you've calmed down. Have a glass of wine and try to compose yourself. Whoever or whatever this was has gone off. And if anything else should happen, just call the station and we'll be right over." My wife was beside herself as the officer said goodbye and left. She said to me, "Honey, I cannot and will not stay here." I tried to console her by saying that whatever she saw was just passing through and had probably moved on. "Oh yeah," she said. "What about those darn fruit trees being picked clean? Maybe it was the same demon from hell eating our fruit. How about that door? Has it dawned on you that maybe your mother had this steel door installed for protection? I'd be willing to bet she saw something and didn't want to bother us over it. You know how she was, all stubborn and everything. She probably saw that monster through the kitchen window just like I did." At that point in time, I didn't want to get into a debate with her. Besides, something really didn't feel right out there in the yard. And when I saw those barn doors opened wide, I knew something had been wandering around my house while my wife and I were inside relaxing. That can most definitely make you feel a little uneasy inside. As it turns out, we both fell asleep in the living room that night. And when morning came, I went outside to have a look around. Everything that had seemed so eerie during the night had changed dramatically with the coming of a new day. I didn't see anything unusual around the property, and I actually fired up the tractor to take a ride around the land. I thought about my father, who loved to cut the fields in any kind of weather, and it was great therapy for me, especially after the night we had. Later that morning, my wife and I took a ride into town to get a few things. When we were leaving the store, we saw a small newspaper rack on the way out, which held a local gazette that was free of charge. Today, a certain headline on the lower right side of the front page caught my attention. "Booger sighted by woman on highway." I grabbed a copy without mentioning it to my wife. Later that day, I pulled out the paper to read the article while my wife was showering. It said a local woman had sighted a Bigfoot walking down the shoulder of a highway, and that area of the highway was only a few miles from our property. The sighting had happened the day before my wife said she saw a ghoul out the kitchen window. If I was to take a walk up through my land and cut across the woods instead of taking the long way around, this sighting had taken place only a mile from our house. That very night, I heard a howling again while my wife was sleeping. In my heart, I was now convinced that my wife had seen the same beast this woman had seen on the side of the highway, and that the source of this howling was one and the same. I was also becoming increasingly more certain that my wife was correct about the door change in the house. What else could be the reason for swapping out a beautiful wooden door, a door that was more likely would have lasted for another 200 years? I was also convinced that this thing was responsible for eating the fruit off the trees in our fields. Maybe 3 or 4 days after my change of heart, I went for a long walk out to the field behind our home. I was really troubled as to what to do. I had become the one who was concerned about this beast. I was strolling slowly, kicking the grass, looking up at the sky, and thinking about my wife and parents. I reached a point in the field where I could see the back part of the property. It was then that I could see a large black creature walking along the edge of the field. I ducked down just enough to allow my eyes to continue watching it without being seen myself. And even at that distance that I was watching from, I could easily gauge the enormity of this thing. I could use every adjective imaginable to describe it. Tall, big, thick, muscular, hairy, damn near everything else you can think of. It was an instantaneous sensory overload. This thing stood out clearly against the land, and I could see the sun shining on its fur. It was very tall, though I couldn't even begin to venture a guess as to how tall. It looked like a black block of living creature walking along. Its arms were extremely long and swung in a slow cadence with each of the steps it took. Every movement it made was very deliberate, in a way that said to me it knew that it was the king. I don't believe that it has any competition in these woods, and now having seen it for myself, I'm certain that it could make short work of anything or anyone that got in its way. It covered about 2 acres of land, walking, before it disappeared into the woods. I went back to the house without saying a word to my wife. She knows about the sighting now, but I hadn't dared disturb her with it back then. Instead, I casually brought up the sale of the house, saying that it was more than we needed at this stage of our lives, and that I missed the old house that we had been renting to the tenants. She was not against my decision to sell, so our saga ended. The house was sold and we moved into another rental house until our tenant's lease was up. My uncle used to live about 6 miles from a busy train station in Atlanta. If you were outside during the morning commute, you could hear the train at the station sound its horn. This Bigfoot's howl was so loud and resounding that I'm sure people can hear it for miles around. Just like the train's horn, and yet I had never heard a single soul speak of hearing it. I don't know if people are afraid to speak about it or what, but it has to be being heard in many other places and by many other people. Well, that's it for the story tonight. Thank you for listening. I would appreciate if you'd hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment. I'll see you next time.